The slap echoed through the marble lobby, louder than any alarm, louder than the clinking glasses at the breakfast bar, louder than the quiet sob a little girl was holding back near the elevator. In one sudden, humiliating moment, a tired single father standing in worn shoes was struck across the face by a woman who believed he was nothing more than a nobody who had crossed his limits. What no one in that hotel realized was that those 9 minutes after the slap would become the longest, most unforgettable 9 minutes of their professional lives. That morning had begun like most mornings in Daniel Carter's life. Heavy and rushed, full of small sacrifices no one noticed. He had woken before dawn in a modest apartment on the edge of the city, the kind of place where the radiator clanked through the night and the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors arguing about bills. The alarm had not gone off. It never needed to. Daniel's body had learned to wake at 4:45, trained by 2 years of solo parenting and the weight of responsibilities that never seemed to lighten. He moved through the darkness of the small bedroom, his feet finding the familiar path to his daughter's room without needing light. Emma was curled beneath her blanket, her small body tucked into a tight ball, her breathing shallow and ragged from the fever that had kept them both awake most of the night. Her hair was messy against the pillow, her cheeks pale, and even in sleep, her face carried a quiet sadness she tried so hard to hide every single day since her mother passed away 2 years earlier. Daniel knelt beside her bed, his hand brushing gently across her forehead. The fever had broken sometime around 3 in the morning, but she was still warm, still fragile. He whispered her name softly, and when she did not stir, he lifted her carefully into his arms, cradling her against his chest as he carried her to the bathroom. She murmured something unintelligible, her small fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, and Daniel felt his heart crack just a little more, the way it did every time he was reminded how much she needed him and how much he wished he could give her more. He dressed her in her school clothes, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to do everything alone. He brushed her hair, packed her lunch with the careful attention of someone who knew that a peanut butter sandwich cut into triangles was the only acceptable shape. He tied her shoes, double-knotting the laces the way Sarah used to do, and reminded her for the 100th time that he would be back before dinner. It was a promise he made every day, even though work often made it hard to keep. But he made it anyway, because promises were all he had left to give her, and breaking them felt like breaking pieces of himself. In the kitchen, Daniel poured cereal into a bowl and set it in front of Emma at their small table. She picked at it without appetite, her spoon moving through the milk but rarely reaching her mouth. He watched her from the counter where he stood drinking cold coffee from a mug that said, "World's Best Dad," a gift from Emma on his last birthday. The irony of that title never escaped him. He felt like the world's most exhausted dad, the world's most overwhelmed dad, the world's just barely holding it together dad. But he kept the mug anyway, because Emma had picked it out herself, and that made it precious beyond measure. Emma was quiet in the car, her head resting against the window, her eyes watching the city wake up around them. She was always quiet these days, had been since the funeral, since the day she stood in a black dress too big for her small frame and watched her mother's casket lowered into the ground. Daniel glanced at her in the rearview mirror, searching for words that might reach her, might bring back the laughter that used to fill their home. She spoke first, her voice small and tired. "Daddy, where are we going today?" Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The school had called the day before, concerned about Emma's fever. They could not take her back until she was fully recovered, and Daniel had no one else. No family nearby, no babysitter he trusted, no neighbors who could help on short notice. His parents lived 3 states away, and Sarah's family had faded from their lives after the funeral, their grief manifesting as distance rather than closeness. He had no options, except the one he was about to take. He was bringing her to work with him, to the hotel downtown, and he could only hope she would be okay sitting quietly while he handled what needed to be handled. "To Daddy's work, sweetheart," he said, forcing lightness into his voice. "You can read your books while I talk to some people. It will not take long." Emma nodded slowly, accepting this the way she accepted everything now, with a resignation no 6-year-old should carry. "Okay, Daddy." Daniel's chest ached as he drove. Everything he did revolved around Emma now. Every breath he took was measured by her needs, her fragile smile, her quiet grief that mirrored his own. He had learned to cook her favorite meals, to braid her hair the way her mother used to read bedtime stories in voices that made her giggle despite herself. He had learned to be both father and mother, provider and comforter, protector and playmate. He had learned to smile when he wanted to cry, and to keep moving forward when all he wanted was to stop. Most days, he felt like he was failing at all of it. But he kept going. He always kept going. Because giving up was never an option when a little girl was counting on him to be her whole world. The hotel appeared on the horizon as Daniel turned onto the main boulevard, a grand structure of glass and stone that shimmered in the early morning light. To most people passing by, it was simply a luxury establishment, the kind of place with chandeliers in the lobby, uniformed staff at every corner, and polished marble floors that reflected the wealth of its clientele. It was the sort of hotel that appeared in travel magazines and hosted dignitaries, a place where rooms cost more per night than some people earned in a week. But to Daniel, it was something else entirely, something far more personal, far more painful. This hotel was the last living dream he shared with his late wife. It was the business they had built together from nothing, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, through years of struggle and hope and love that seemed infinite at the time. He remembered the day they had stood on this very spot, back when it was nothing but an empty lot filled with weeds and broken concrete. Sarah had squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with a vision only she could see. "We are going to build something beautiful here, Daniel. A place where everyone who walks through the door feels like they have come home." He had believed her. He had always believed her, even when the banks turned them down, even when the construction ran over budget, even when they worked 18-hour days and survived on coffee and determination. They had poured everything into this place, their savings, their energy, their dreams for the future. And when the doors finally opened, when the first guests checked in and Sarah stood in the lobby with tears streaming down her face, Daniel had known that every sacrifice had been worth it. For years, the hotel thrived beyond anything they had imagined. It became known not just for its elegant accommodations but for its warmth, its genuine hospitality, the way staff members seemed to actually care about the people they served. Travel critics wrote glowing reviews that praised the personal touches, the attention to detail, the feeling that guests were not just customers but welcomed friends. Repeat bookings soared. Word of mouth spread through business networks and family gatherings and social media posts that captured moments of unexpected kindness. Sarah had a gift for creating that atmosphere, for hiring people who shared her values and training them to treat every guest like family. She conducted interviews herself for years, asking questions that went beyond qualifications and experience to probe character and empathy. She knew the names of regular visitors, remembered their preferences, sent handwritten notes when they celebrated milestones. When a family checked in for a child's birthday, Sarah made sure there were balloons waiting in the room. When an elderly couple returned for their anniversary, she arranged for their favorite flowers to be placed on the nightstand. The hotel was not just a business to her, it was an extension of who she was, a living monument to her belief that kindness could be profitable and that treating people well was always the right strategy. Then Sarah got sick. The diagnosis came suddenly, a shadow that fell across their lives without warning. One day she was full of energy, planning renovations and interviewing candidates for a new manager position. The next day, she was sitting in a doctor's office, her face pale as words like tumor and aggressive and treatment options hung in the air between them. The months that followed blurred together in Daniel's memory. Treatments, hospital stays, brief periods of hope followed by devastating setbacks. Through it all, he tried to keep the hotel running, tried to maintain the standards Sarah had established, but his attention was divided and his heart was broken. He hired a management company to handle daily operations, trusting them to preserve what Sarah had built while he focused on being with her. Sarah died on a Tuesday morning in spring, with Daniel holding her hand and Emma curled up beside her on the hospital bed. Her last words were about the hotel, about making sure it stayed true to what they had created together. Daniel had promised her, through tears and grief so heavy he could barely breathe, that he would protect their dream. But grief had a way of changing priorities. After Sarah passed, Daniel stepped back from the hotel almost entirely. He attended board meetings and signed paperwork, but he no longer walked the floors or spoke with staff or monitored the culture that had once made this place special. He was too busy learning how to be a single father, too consumed by his own pain and Emma's pain to think about anything else. Almost no one here recognized him anymore. The management company had cycled through several sets of leadership, each more disconnected from the hotel's founding vision than the last. And on days like today, when he walked through the front doors dressed in worn jeans and a faded jacket, exhausted from a sleepless night at his daughter's bedside, he looked like just another visitor who had wandered into the wrong place. Daniel led Emma across the lobby, her small hand tucked safely in his. The space was exactly as Sarah had envisioned it. Soaring ceilings, soft lighting, fresh flowers on every surface. But something felt different now. Something Daniel could not quite name. The warmth Sarah had wanted, that sense of welcome and belonging, seemed to have faded, replaced by something colder, more transactional. Staff members moved through the space with efficiency but without joy. Their smiles looked practiced rather than genuine, and the way they looked at certain guests, the ones who did not fit the image of wealth and privilege, carried an unmistakable edge of judgment. Daniel guided Emma to a plush sofa near the windows, away from the busiest areas. "Sit here and read your book, sweetheart. Daddy needs to talk to some people, but I will be right over there where you can see me, okay?" Emma nodded, pulling a worn paperback from her backpack. It was one of Sarah's old books, a children's story about a magical garden that Emma had read so many times the pages were soft and fragile. She clutched it like a lifeline, the way she clutched everything that reminded her of her mother. Daniel watched her for a moment, his heart heavy with love and worry and guilt. Then he turned and walked toward the front desk, steeling himself for what was about to come. He had received a complaint through an anonymous feedback channel, one that mentioned rude behavior and neglect toward families with children. The details had been vague but troubling, enough to pull Daniel from his self-imposed exile and bring him here in person. He wanted to understand what was happening in the place Sarah had loved so much, the place that was supposed to embody everything she believed in. Daniel approached the front desk with his shoulders slumped from exhaustion, his face unshaven, his eyes carrying the weight of years of grief and responsibility. He looked nothing like the owner of a luxury hotel. He looked like a man who had been beaten down by life and was still somehow standing. To the staff behind the counter, he appeared to be just another guest who did not quite belong among the expensive suits and polished smiles that populated their lobby. The receptionist glanced up, her gaze sweeping over him with barely concealed disdain. Her eyes lingered on his worn shoes, his faded jacket, the shadows under his eyes. She did not greet him. She did not smile. She simply returned her attention to her computer screen, as if hoping he would take the hint and leave. Daniel waited. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 3. A businessman in a tailored suit was helped immediately. A couple dripping with designer accessories was offered champagne while their reservation was processed. Daniel continued to stand there, invisible, unwanted, watching the staff interact with people they deemed worthy of their attention. Finally, he cleared his throat and spoke. "Excuse me, I would like to speak with someone about a complaint I received." The receptionist looked up again, her expression shifting from indifference to irritation. "A complaint? Sir, if you have an issue with your stay, you can fill out a comment card and leave it in the box by the door." "I am not a guest," Daniel said calmly. "I received feedback about this hotel through a private channel, and I would like to discuss it with a manager." Something flickered in the receptionist's eyes. Suspicion, perhaps, or the beginning of hostility. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, another voice cut through the air. "Is there a problem here?" Daniel turned to see a woman approaching from the back office. She was tall and sharp-featured, dressed in an immaculate suit that probably cost more than Daniel's entire wardrobe. Her heels clicked against the marble with authority, and her eyes swept over Daniel the way a hawk might examine prey. This was the manager on duty. Daniel recognized the type immediately. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had built her power on fear and intimidation, who believed that authority came from making others feel small. Her name tag read Victoria Shaw, and the way the receptionist straightened at her approach told Daniel everything he needed to know about how she ran her domain. "This gentleman says he received a complaint about our hotel," the receptionist explained, her voice carrying a subtle mockery. "He wants to speak with a manager." Victoria Shaw turned her full attention to Daniel, her gaze traveling slowly from his scuffed shoes to his unshaven face. The judgment in her eyes was unmistakable, the kind of casual cruelty that comes from people who measure worth by appearances alone. "And who exactly are you?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. Daniel kept his voice even. "My name is Daniel Carter. I received some troubling feedback about staff behavior, particularly toward families with children. I was hoping we could discuss it privately." Something shifted in Victoria's posture. Her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, and her eyes narrowed with a hostility that seemed to come from nowhere. Perhaps it was his calm tone that offended her, or his request for a private conversation, or simply the fact that he had dared to question the way she ran things. Whatever the cause, her reaction was immediate and aggressive. "I do not know who you think you are," she said, her voice rising enough to draw attention from nearby guests, "but you cannot just walk in here making accusations. This hotel maintains the highest standards of service. If you have a problem with that, I suggest you take it up with someone who cares." Daniel remained calm, though he could feel his pulse quickening. "I am not making accusations. I am asking questions. There were specific complaints about rude treatment and discrimination. I think it is worth investigating." Victoria's face flushed with anger. Her hands clenched at her sides, and for a moment, she seemed to struggle with her composure. Around them, the lobby had grown quieter. Guests were pausing their conversations. Staff members were watching from the corners of their eyes. And near the elevators, Emma had looked up from her book, her small face tight with worry. "You have some nerve," Victoria hissed. "Coming in here dressed like that, looking like you just crawled out of a shelter, and demanding to speak to management about complaints. Do you have any idea who you are talking to?" "I know exactly who I am talking to," Daniel said quietly, "and I am asking you, respectfully, to lower your voice so we can have a civil conversation. It was the wrong thing to say. Or perhaps it was the right thing, because what happened next revealed exactly what kind of person Victoria Shaw truly was." In a moment of unchecked arrogance and rage, she raised her hand and slapped Daniel across the face. The sound cut through the lobby like glass shattering, sharp and violent and impossible to ignore. His head snapped to the side from the force of it, and for a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to stop. Guests froze mid-step. The receptionist's mouth fell open. Staff members turned away, pretending not to see, their silence a complicity that would haunt them later. And near the elevators, Emma, the little girl who had already lost her mother, watched with wide and terrified eyes as her father staggered slightly but did not fall. Daniel did not shout. He did not raise his hand or his voice. He did not do any of the things that rage might have demanded. Instead, he stood there, absorbing not just the physical pain of the slap, but the deeper pain of being humiliated in front of his child. The sting on his cheek was nothing compared to the knowledge that Emma had witnessed this, that her father, her protector, her whole world, had been struck by a stranger while she watched helplessly. His first instinct was not revenge. It was not even anger. It was simply to make sure Emma was okay. He walked slowly toward the sofa where she sat frozen, her book forgotten in her lap, tears streaming silently down her pale cheeks. He knelt in front of her, bringing himself to her level, and gently wiped her tears with his thumb. "It is okay, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice steady despite everything. "Daddy is okay. I need you to sit here for just a few more minutes. Can you do that for me?" Emma nodded, her lip trembling, her small hands clutching her book like a shield. She did not speak, but her eyes said everything. She was scared, confused, and looking to him for reassurance that the world made sense. Daniel kissed her forehead softly, then stood and turned back to face the lobby. His calmness frightened the staff more than any outburst could have. There was something in his eyes now, a quiet resolve that made people uncomfortable, that suggested depths they could not fathom. He looked around the space, noting how quickly eyes dropped when they met his, how no one had stepped forward to intervene, how silence had become complicity. Every person in this lobby had witnessed an assault and done nothing. They had chosen safety over decency, and Daniel understood in that moment that the rot in this hotel ran far deeper than one cruel manager. Victoria Shaw stood near the front desk, her face flushed with vindication, still believing she had asserted her dominance over some troublemaker who had wandered in off the street. She was already whispering to staff members, gesturing toward Daniel, probably giving orders to have him removed. Daniel checked his watch. 9 minutes. That was all the time he needed. In those 9 minutes, Daniel walked slowly to a quiet corner of the lobby and made a series of phone calls. Each call was brief, controlled, and heavy with meaning. His voice never rose above a conversational tone, but the words he spoke carried weight that would soon become apparent. Years ago, when he and Sarah had first opened this hotel, they had made promises to each other about the kind of business they would run. It would be a place built on respect, where every guest felt valued regardless of how they looked or how much money they carried. It would be a place where staff were treated with dignity and expected to treat others the same way. It would be, above all, a reflection of who they were and what they believed. Daniel had failed to protect that vision. He could see that now with painful clarity. In his grief, in his retreat from the world, he had allowed others to reshape the culture of this place into something Sarah would not recognize. The anonymous complaints, the drop in family bookings, the tension he had sensed but chosen to ignore, these were all symptoms of a disease he had let take root. The slap was not the problem, it was merely the moment that forced him to see everything else. While Daniel made his calls, Victoria paced near the front desk with triumphant energy. She whispered to the receptionist, to the bellhop, to anyone who would listen, spinning a narrative about the crazy man who had tried to intimidate her and how she had put him in his place. Some employees nodded nervously, afraid to disagree with a woman who held their jobs in her hands. Others looked uneasy, sensing that something was deeply wrong but unwilling to risk their positions by speaking up. Emma sat alone on the sofa, her small body curled into itself, her eyes fixed on her father across the lobby. She did not understand everything that was happening, but she understood enough. She understood that someone had hurt her daddy. She understood that the adults around her were pretending it had not happened. And she understood, in the way that children sometimes understand things adults cannot, that her father was not defeated. He was waiting. Daniel caught her eye between phone calls and gave her a small nod, a signal they had developed over 2 years of learning to communicate without words. It meant, "I am okay, and I love you, and this will be over soon." Emma nodded back, though her lips still trembled and her cheeks were still wet with tears. As the minutes ticked by, Daniel's mind worked through everything that needed to happen next. He thought about the complaints he had received, the patterns he had dismissed, the culture of cruelty that had apparently taken hold in his absence. He thought about Sarah's dream and how far this place had fallen from what she had envisioned. And he thought about Emma, about the kind of world he wanted her to grow up in, about the lessons she was learning from watching how adults behaved. At the end of the 9th minute, the atmosphere in the lobby shifted like the air before a storm. The hotel doors opened, not with the casual ease of arriving guests, but with purpose. Senior board members entered first, their faces grave and focused. Behind them came legal advisors in dark suits, the head of corporate security, and the director of human resources. They moved through the lobby in formation, their presence so unexpected and so clearly deliberate that every conversation stopped and every eye turned to watch. Victoria's confident expression flickered. She recognized some of these faces from company portraits and quarterly reports, the kind of executives who never appeared on the ground floor unless something significant was happening. Confusion rippled through the staff as they tried to understand why the upper echelons of corporate power had suddenly descended upon their lobby. Daniel stepped forward from his corner, his voice calm but carrying across the marble space. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice." Every head turned toward him. The tired man in worn clothes, the nobody who had been slapped and dismissed, was suddenly addressing the most powerful people in the organization as if they worked for him. Victoria's face went pale. "Sir, I do not know what you think you are doing, but these people are here for official business. Security, please remove this man before he causes any more disruption." No one moved. Daniel looked at her with something that might have been pity. "Miss Shaw, my name is Daniel Carter. I am the founder and majority owner of this hotel and the entire hospitality group it belongs to. I built this place with my wife before she passed away, and I have been observing how it operates in my absence." The color drained from faces around the room. Victoria's mouth opened and closed without sound, her mind struggling to reconcile the man she had slapped with the name she had seen on ownership documents but never connected to a real person. Staff members who had ignored Daniel, mocked him, watched him be assaulted without intervening, suddenly understood the magnitude of their mistake. The lobby fell into a silence so complete that the soft music from the speakers seemed deafening. Daniel continued, his voice steady but heavy with disappointment. "My wife and I built this hotel on a simple principle. Every person who walked through those doors would be treated with respect and kindness, regardless of how they looked or how much money they had. That was not just a business strategy, it was a reflection of who we were and what we believed." He paused, letting his words settle over the crowd. "What I witnessed today, and what I have learned in recent weeks, tells me that this principle has been abandoned. I watched a manager assault a guest in full view of staff and customers, and not one person stepped forward to intervene. I have received complaints about discrimination, about rudeness, about a culture of cruelty that treats some people as worthy of respect and others as beneath notice." His eyes moved across the room, meeting the gazes of employees who quickly looked away. "I am not here to scream or threaten or humiliate anyone the way I was humiliated. That is not who I am, and it is not what my wife would have wanted. But I am here to make changes, because a business can survive financial losses. It cannot survive moral decay." Daniel turned to the head of human resources, who nodded grimly. Then came the decision that would echo through the building long after that day ended. Effective immediately, the following actions will be taken. Victoria Shaw is terminated for cause. The on-duty staff who witnessed the assault and failed to report it or intervene are suspended pending review. This hotel will close for the remainder of the day for a full internal assessment. Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out strangled and desperate. "You cannot do this. I will sue. You have no proof. It is my word against yours." Daniel's expression did not change. "There are security cameras throughout this lobby. Miss Shaw, everything that happened here today is recorded. But more importantly, there are witnesses. And I suspect that when those witnesses are interviewed individually, away from your influence, they will tell the truth about what they saw." He turned to address the broader group. "For those of you who wish to continue working here, there will be a process. You will be interviewed, retrained, and given the opportunity to demonstrate that you understand what this hotel is supposed to represent. But I want to be clear about something. The culture of this place is going to change. If you cannot treat every person who walks through those doors with basic human decency, regardless of how they are dressed or what you assume about their bank account, then this is not the right place for you. Victoria was escorted out by security, her protests growing quieter as she disappeared through the back entrance. Some staff members wept. Others stared at the floor in shame. A few looked at Daniel with something that might have been gratitude, the relief of people who had wanted to speak up but had been too afraid. Daniel walked back to where Emma sat, still clutching her book, still watching with eyes too old for her young face. He scooped her up into his arms and held her tight, feeling her small body relax against his chest as she realized the scary part was over. "I am sorry you had to see that, sweetheart," he whispered into her hair. Emma's arms tightened around his neck. "Are you okay, Daddy?" "I am okay. Let us go home." He carried her out of the lobby, past the executives and lawyers and stunned employees, past the marble floors and crystal chandeliers, out into the morning sunlight where the world felt cleaner somehow, less suffocating. Behind him, the hotel was already beginning its transformation, though the real work would take weeks and months to complete. That night, after the phone calls and meetings and legal consultations were finished, Daniel sat on the edge of Emma's bed while she lay tucked beneath her blankets. The old stuffed rabbit that had belonged to her mother rested beside her pillow, its worn ears soft from years of being held and loved. Daniel looked at his daughter, at the traces of Sarah he could see in her eyes and her smile and the stubborn set of her chin. She was so young to have lost so much, so young to carry the weight of grief that even adults struggled to bear. "Emma," he said softly, "I want to apologize for today. What happened at the hotel, what you saw, that was not something you should have had to witness." Emma was quiet for a moment, her small fingers playing with the edge of her blanket. "The lady was mean to you," she said finally. "She hit you." "Yes, she did. Why did you not hit her back?" Daniel considered his answer carefully. "Because hitting someone back does not fix anything, sweetheart. It just makes more pain. And being kind does not mean being weak. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand up for what is right without becoming the kind of person who hurts others." Emma thought about this, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Is that why you made her leave?" "I made her leave because she was hurting people, not just me, but the workers and the guests. And when someone keeps hurting people, they cannot stay in a place that is supposed to be safe." Emma nodded slowly, processing this in her own way. She reached out and touched Daniel's cheek, right where Victoria had struck him. "Does it still hurt?" Daniel caught her hand and kissed her palm. "Not anymore." They sat together in silence for a while, the kind of comfortable quiet that exists between people who love each other deeply. Emma's eyes drifted to the photograph on her nightstand, the one of Sarah laughing in a sunlit garden, her hair blowing in the wind. "Daddy, do you think Mommy would be happy about what you did today?" Daniel's throat tightened with emotion. He looked at the photograph, at the woman he had loved more than anything, and felt her presence in the room like a warmth he could almost touch. "I think Mommy would be proud," he said quietly. "She always believed in treating people with kindness, no matter who they were. The hotel was supposed to be a place where everyone felt welcome. I let that slip away for a while, but I am going to fix it now. For her, and for you." Emma smiled, the first real smile Daniel had seen from her all day. "I am proud of you too, Daddy." The words hit Daniel harder than any slap ever could. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, lingering there for a moment to breathe in the scent of her shampoo, to feel the warmth of her small body, to remember why everything he did mattered. "I love you, sweetheart. Get some sleep." "I love you too, Daddy." He turned off the lamp and walked to the door, pausing to look back at her one more time. In the dim light from the hallway, he could see her settling into her pillow, her rabbit tucked under her arm, her eyes already growing heavy. Daniel stood there for a long moment, thinking about Sarah, about Emma, about the hotel and everything it represented. He thought about the staff members who had looked away when he needed help, and the ones who had seemed relieved when change finally came. He thought about Victoria Shaw and wondered if she would ever understand what she had lost, not just her job, but the chance to be part of something meaningful. And he thought about strength, real strength, the kind that does not come from power or money or the ability to hurt others. It comes from standing firm in your values, from protecting what matters, from choosing to rebuild rather than destroy. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. But tonight, his daughter was safe and loved and proud of him. And that was enough. The hotel reopened 3 weeks later, transformed in ways that went far beyond new staff and revised policies. Daniel had spent those weeks working alongside the human resources team, interviewing every employee who wished to return, retraining those who showed genuine commitment to change, and personally overseeing the development of new protocols designed to ensure that what had happened to him could never happen to another guest. The changes were visible the moment anyone walked through the doors. The same marble floors and crystal chandeliers remained, but the atmosphere had shifted. Staff members smiled genuinely, greeted every guest with warmth, and moved through the lobby with purpose rather than performance. Families with children were welcomed enthusiastically, their needs anticipated and accommodated without hesitation. The judgment that had once hung in the air, that unspoken assessment of who deserved good service and who did not, had vanished entirely. Daniel returned to a more active role in the business, not because he loved power or missed the prestige, but because he finally understood that leadership meant presence. He could not protect Sarah's vision from a distance. He had to be there, day after day, modeling the behavior he expected and holding others accountable when they fell short. Victoria Shaw faced consequences beyond losing her job. The security footage from that morning had been reviewed by lawyers, and she was charged with assault. Her professional reputation, built on intimidation and cruelty, crumbled in the harsh light of public scrutiny. Daniel took no pleasure in her downfall. If anything, he felt a distant sadness for someone so lost in her own ego that she had destroyed everything she had worked to build. Some of the former staff reached out to Daniel in the weeks and months that followed. They wrote letters and emails, called his office, even showed up at the hotel hoping to speak with him. Most of them expressed regret, admitting that they had known something was wrong but had been too afraid to speak up. Daniel listened to each of them, because he understood that growth often begins with regret, and because he believed in second chances even when they were hard to give. Emma became a familiar presence at the hotel, after school and on weekends. She had her own spot in the lobby cafe, where she did homework while waiting for her father, and the staff learned to keep a supply of her favorite cookies and hot chocolate on hand. They called her the little boss, though always with affection, and Emma gradually began to smile more often, to laugh more easily, to shed some of the sadness that had weighed on her for so long. Daniel watched his daughter blossom in that space, watched her make friends with the bellhops and chat with the concierge and help the housekeeping staff fold napkins in the back room. On slow afternoons, she would sit at the front desk with the receptionists, practicing her handwriting by filling out welcome cards for incoming guests. She learned the names of regular visitors, just as her mother had once done, and she greeted them with a warmth that seemed to come naturally, as if Sarah's spirit lived on in her daughter's smile. She was learning what it meant to treat people with kindness, to see value in everyone, regardless of their job title or their clothes or where they came from. She understood, in the way that children absorb lessons without being explicitly taught, that a person's worth was not measured by their appearance, but by how they treated others. She was becoming the kind of person Sarah would have been proud of, the kind of person Daniel hoped he could be worthy of raising. Years later, when Emma was old enough to understand the full story, she would tell people about the day her father was slapped in his own hotel. But she never described it as a day of humiliation or anger. Instead, she called it the day she learned what real strength looked like. A man who did not strike back. A man who protected his values. A man who chose to rebuild rather than destroy. Because in a world where power is often loud and cruel, the quiet courage of doing what is right can change everything.